All right. Okay. Fantastic. Look, let me welcome you, and hopefully we'll, as we get into the next few minutes, we'll fill up all of these chairs, because this is going to be a cracker of a panel, a really interesting hour ahead, and some really interesting conversations going to take place. First of all, welcoming to those who are online, who are participating online. Also, want to just say this is an ISFC event, which is the International Sustainable Forestry Coalition, and we always start our events because we're global and we really want to lean forward into the space that we want to share and collaborate in. We always start with an acknowledgement of the First Nations people who operate and have lived in the areas around the world where our companies work for millennia, many millennia, the first land managers, and so we wanted to start like that. My name's Ross Hampton, and I'm the Executive Director of the newish, we're now a year and a bit old, please come and sit, come in, Kamada-san, come and sit down. We are operating around the world as a new private sector collective of the world's leading forestry companies who are really interested in leaning into the climate and nature transition, the bioeconomy transition. And we're now 35 countries under our umbrella, 16.5 million hectares that our companies steward. And I say steward because that really is how the companies see their work in the landscape. They see themselves as looking after for perpetuity this wonderful heritage, which involves the bioeconomy, supporting the bioeconomy, but also supporting nature outcomes, as we just heard in the last wonderful panel, supporting nature and climate outcomes as well. And so that's the International Sustainable Forestry Coalition. And we're here and we're delighted to take part in this special day, and we thank the organisers for giving us a bit of time to look at scaling forestry and climate and nature outcomes using technology and new models of thinking. And if you didn't think you were at that panel, then you are, and I recommend you stay right here, because this is going to be the best panel at COP. So you've done the right thing, and if you're meant to be here, even better, because you're going to hear some incredible people here on the panel. They're going to introduce what they do, and they're also going to talk about the concept of technology and innovation in their particular patch. So I'm not going to do a long introduction, but I will just say we have Sarita Severian from Susano, the Sustainability Manager, here on my right. Next to her is Sarah Bray, who's from Australia, and she's the Senior Policy Manager there at the Australian Forest Products Association. Sky Glenday, next to her, the CEO of Climate Friendly. And at the end of the panel, Yung Woo Na, who's from the International Forestry Students Association and is an intern at FAO. So we've got some really diverse perspectives going forward here. And I've asked them to think about innovation in a different way, sort of a different part of the cube, if you like, that we're looking at today. So I'm going to start with you on my right here, Sarita. What I wanted you to talk about after you introduce yourself and tell us a bit about Susano is talk about the innovations in the thinking about integrating nature outcomes, water outcomes, biodiversity outcomes with production outcomes. Because I am too often told that we can't have it all. I don't know about you, but if you're interested in the forest space, you've probably heard this before, that people say we can't do the circular bioeconomy and look after nature and the environment. I'm told that quite a lot. They say, well, how are you supposed to pivot to building everything out of timber instead of steel and concrete? Where's the timber going to come from? And I'm delighted to say that there are answers. They're sometimes complicated, but companies are grappling with it and thinking about it differently. And a company like Susano, we're about to hear, has, I think, some of the most impressive outcomes in the world in regards to this, managing these multiple outcomes. Sarita, over to you. You can stay there or come up. What do you want? Stay there? Yeah. What do you prefer?
No, I can stay here. Yeah. Hello, everybody. Good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm really proud in Global Forestry Pavilion. Yeah, I said to Gonçalo Munoz, who's passed here, and hey, this is my house. We are in our house as a forestry and forest pulp and paper company. Yeah, Suzano is the biggest pulp producer in the world. We have an area close to the Belgian country. It's almost the same. It's 2.6 million hectares of forestry, where 40% of that is protected and conserved area. So biodiversity is into the forest and eucalyptus production. The forestry, the protection areas we are totally dependent from what the ecosystem services that these areas provided for us. The soil conservation, the water resources, the temperature, everything. It's really important for us. Well, Suzano is producing pulp, but Suzano is pulping more than that. We are exporting this pulp for more than 100 countries in the world. In all regions, we have products from Suzano, and this pulp is used to paper, toilet paper, paper package, and we have innovations. Really, we invest a lot in innovations where we are developing new products, such as textiles. We have a company in Finland named Spinova that is producing a textile that can replace the cotton, the visco, the polyester, and use 90% less water to produce. On the other hand, we are investing in startups. There's one startup that we are testing lignin inside the batteries used for small vehicles, like motorcycles, where we use the bio-based product in these electric vehicles. And this is what we are doing in our day by day, looking for that, but we want to go further. Suzano is under the politics. We have a lot of regulations for where we are exporting, what we are doing in Brazil. We are not deforesting. We are implementing our forestry in the pasture land or degraded areas, but we want to go beyond. We set it 15 targets where I will erase 3 targets. The first one is related to climate change. We have a forestry. Forest is doing photosynthesis. So we want to remove 40 million tons from the atmosphere, carbon, 40 million tons of carbon from the atmosphere in our forestries. We want to connect corridors for biodiversity. Our native area, it's so important for us, and we are working with the neighborhoods, and we'll create 500,000 hectares of native conservation areas for help the biodiversity in some countries in Brazil. And last, as we are in 200 municipalities in Brazil, we want to help 200,000, a lot of numbers, yeah, 200,000 people in Brazil to lift the poverty. We are in the country really hard and complex reality, and we want to work with these communities to help them to create their own income, not to give them money, but help them with agriculture, with fisheries, with a lot of projects that they can help and survive for the next years. So I stop here. A lot of stories to tell.
They're great stories, and we're probably going to come back to some of them. I think we could probably do a whole other panel about trees going into electric cars, but we won't have time for that today. That was a fascinating thing. But you know, I did read somewhere, Sarita, that Suzano plants 1.2 million trees a day. Is that
a day? Yes.
People understand that. If we're speaking English, and I wish I spoke all your languages, but are people getting that number? 1.2 million a day.
Trees.
And the reason I think that's important is just because in COPs and many UN events I go to, everyone laments the difficulty of doing anything at scale. And I like to point out that there are companies in the world doing things at scale. Now, can we do other things at scale as well? Well, that's the big question. That's what we're trying to get to at COPs. But I think people don't understand sometimes just how important and how massive it is, the private sector in regards to its ability to do things when it really wants to move, and when we've got the right signals in the market. Thank you, Sarita. Sarah, I wanted you to, you've got a whole range of things I know you're an expert in with your many years in politics and in forestry in Australia, but I asked you to touch on a new model that's really emerging in Australia, which is agro-farm sort of based, which is really a big new change, I think, in Australia. And I know you told me it's been trialled very successfully, and it also has both fibre outcomes and biodiversity outcomes and carbon outcomes and primary production outcomes. That's what the new model of thinking I was hoping you'd tell us about.
Yeah, thanks, Ross. So I'm Sarah Bray from the Australian Forest Products Association. We're an industry association that represents growers, forest growers, plantation and natural forestry, sawmills and the pulp and paper factories in Australia. And yes, Ross, I've been to a pretty amazing farm in Victoria. I've actually had the joy of being there twice. And it's owned by a couple, Mark Wooten and Eve Cantor. And they're a very sweet couple. And they purchased the property in 1996. So when they purchased the property, they actually did a bird survey, which is probably not the first thing that lots of people do when they purchase a property. But when they did, they found that they actually had 48 bird species on it. It was a pretty degraded farm, and it had a lot of salinity issues, so high salt in the soil, and that was in part because of a previous government policy to cut down trees across the property. So they did something pretty radical. They planted 10% of their productive land under biodiversity plantings. They had a creek and a wetland on their property, and they planted that out with biodiversity plantings. So 10% of their production area gone. They planted another 10% of their productive area, so the area adjacent to those biodiversity plantings, in plantation forestry trees. And it was a native species that grows for at least 30 years for high value timber, for appearance grade timber in our beautiful furniture and other appearance grade uses. So what do we reckon? He lost 20%, or they lost 20% of their productive area. What happened to his profits and production? Any guesses from the crowd? How much did it go down, his profits and production?
20%.
20%.
Surely.
It's not right. Any other guesses from the crowd? It went up. Jane, look at you go. It did. It went up. He has actually doubled his food and fibre production on that property by taking 20% of his property out of production. And he's also had a net return of at least 10% profits over the last 20 years in 85% of the years. And he's done that. You sort of might wonder why that's the case, but because he's got a special lambing paddock that the sheep lamb in. So he does lamb and beef, and because of the cover that the trees provide, the soil is warmer, and he has higher survival rates of his lambs. And they also don't have the wind chill, so he's increased his rate of his lamb survival. Also, actually, he came to COP 2 years ago in Sharm, and while he was here, there was a once-in-a-generation flood on his property. And as I said, so he has those biodiversity plantings along the creek, but adjacent to that is those plantation forestry plantings. So it actually expanded into those plantations. That's not expected. He didn't plant them thinking that would assist, but actually that helped stabilise the soil until the moisture could be soaked into the soil, saving that valuable soil and keeping it on his property. He's done a bird survey again more recently. And so remember back in 96, 48 bird species, which I think is actually quite a lot of bird species. But anyway, now he has 174 bird species on his property. And another unexpected benefit, obviously the biodiversity plantings helped significantly with that, bringing back native species onto the property. But an unexpected benefit was that during drought years, he had a lot of bird species that were flocking to his plantation forestry, which is a native species again, because the trees in the national parks nearby and also his own native vegetation plantings were struggling. But those trees were established well enough to help those birds through that drought species. So he's a high input, high output farm. As he talks about, he likes to shorten the amount of time that he has the lamb on his farm till it gets its head chopped off. He's quite a brutal man. And he's really focused on animal health. He's making sure that those animals are as healthy as they can be. He's making sure the lactation rates are as high as they can be. He's got a really high birth rate on his sheep. So most have twins. And he keeps the lambs alive. He keeps the lambs alive by looking after them and making sure they're at peak nutrition. So he's actually, for a result of all of these things, he's actually 90% carbon neutral, and he's a red meat producer, and he produces a lot. The interesting thing though, Ross, is that now it's almost 30 years. Almost 30 years are up, and those trees are ready to be harvested. And so they've stopped sequestering as much as they have been. So he needs to harvest those trees, replant them and plant a little bit more to maintain as close as he is to carbon neutrality. He's still got many challenges to come that he's looking at tweaking in relation to additives and other things to reduce his methane on his livestock, but it's a pretty incredible example of what's possible.
Thanks, Sarah. When you said he's a large producer, I mean, I think that's important. It's the question I asked Sarita as well. I mean, this is not a pocket-sized farm, is it? How many head do you know?
Now you're really testing me, Ross. I think it was 40,000 sheep that he has on his properties. Very impressive farmer, with the neatest farm I've ever seen in my life.
So that's another, I think it's an important point that certainly we're trying to make at ISFC, is that these goodnesses that we're trying to do in climate and carbon and biodiversity outcomes, they don't have to be just tiny little plots. We can find ways to scale this. As you heard from Sarita, there's a 500,000 hectare or acre project, 8 hectares wasn't it, going through the Cesano estates, and this is a very large sheep property in Australia, which is, in general, fundamentally, the red meat sector in Australia has never really thought to try to diversify in the way that Sarah's just described it. Just last question to you before I go to Sky. Do you know, is that being popularised in the has the national farmers community, for example, embraced it? What's your sense of how that's going down in Australia? Yeah,
I mean, he and his wife have a lot of farmers visiting. Regularly, multiple times a week. He has farmers. It's now an example of what's possible. And the National Farmers Federation in Australia actually has a goal of farmers achieving 5% of their income by 2030 from the carbon markets and biodiversity markets. So it's something that farmers in Australia are really targeting, getting to approaching that carbon neutrality. The red meat sector itself has a goal of carbon neutral by 2030. Yeah. And it's really, I think people were sceptical when they first came out with that, but they've actually gone a long way towards that, and it's actually possibly achievable. So probably another example of setting a target, doing some ambitious things, and you might actually just get there.
Yeah, I think the big change, thanks, I'll go to Sky now. And Sky, you can probably comment on this, no doubt your work takes you into this space. It's been described to me that this generation is able to look through both ends of the telescope when it comes to the land sector, which is what is giving us this big breakthrough moment. And what I mean is, progressively, especially in the forest sector, companies have got very large, and they have very large land holdings. They've got landscape level land holdings that they can work with, but they also have an incredible granularity of site, right, Sky? I'm sure your work takes you here. You can get right down in your measurements down to a very fine-tuned measurement, and we're doing some analysis at ISFC about what that means, because we've seen examples where a large wheat farm in Australia, for example, can be mapped and hotspotted against the productive square metre areas and the less productive square metre areas. And so then you find out you're getting 98% of your profits off 80% of the farm, which is what happens because you can map it properly. well, then the farmer can say, well, why don't I pivot to something else for that other 20%, and we'll probably get an uplift. And our preliminary modelling is suggesting a 5 to 10% opportunity in these more marginal areas, no matter what your primary agricultural approach is. Now, as you just said, Sarah, it will rely on coherent markets being in place. In Australia, there is a very strong and coherent and viable carbon market. There's also a nature positive market that's emerging that I hope Sky's going to tell us a bit more about. But they're the sorts of opportunities that are going to come forward that are going to let us do, I think, nature and climate at far greater scale. So Sky's going to come to us now from Climate Friendly, which I was really pleased you were coming to COP, Sky, because Climate Friendly is also so innovative in its thinking about the landscape in Australia. I think you've got ambitions to go further afield, but particularly Australia, and working in both the forestry sector and the ag sector, and in carbon and in production, and really trying to put all those pieces together. So over to you, Sky.
Yeah, thanks, Ross. So lovely to be here today. I'm the co-CEO of Climate Friendly. And as Ross said, we partner with land managers in Australia to urgently store carbon, repair nature, and also advance reconciliation with traditional owners. So far, we've established under the carbon farming scheme with our land manager partners over 160 carbon farming projects that cover about 10 million hectares of land around Australia. And they've already generated around 30 million tonnes of abatement to date. Over their life cycle, they'll generate more like 120 million tonnes over the 25 years that the projects run for. And we're hoping to sort of scale those partnerships up by next year to over 150 million tonnes of partnerships. Now, similar to you described on Jigsaw Farms, Sarah, that's basically what we do with those array of land managers in Australia, that they help to put the different parts of their land, I guess, into the best use and to repair nature, improve their production, and to really kind of map that out across the property. So one of the innovations that we've been working on this year is co-developing a natural capital standard for Australia. You might have heard here lots of discussions around the task force that spun off from the climate risk disclosures. Increasingly, companies are needing to report in their financial, insurance and supply chains on climate risk. And the Nature Disclosure Task Force is sort of now coming thick and fast. And so the goal of this standard is to kind of contextualise that in an Australian context and to take it down, I guess, to an activity level. A good way to think about it, you've probably all bought your various electronic devices to COP, and you might end up with a whole jumble of charging cables. I had some in my bag, but I left them over there.
We can visualise it. We did talk about this. I said that is a great analogy, but we can visualise it.
We're trying to skip from that sort of jumble of cables in the drawer to kind of one USB-C, which I guess is where we're going globally on electronics. Each farm will have sort of the same unique sets of attributes as you described with Jigsaw Farms, but we need a consistent way of reporting on that and using technology to kind of codify that. The reason that's super important is a land manager might be a forestry producer, they might have agricultural commodities, they'll have their nature and carbon benefits, they'll all be a little bit unique, but they'll also all have off-takers of those different kinds of commodities. They might have debt through a financial institution, an insurer. If they're going to have to report to all those different supply chains, and the people they're reporting to have different standards and we're not in USB-C, then you've got to generate a whole pile of different information to kind of suit each different supply chain. Likewise, if I'm a bank and I'm lending and we don't have a standard, then I'm receiving reports from different farmers that don't kind of add up into a portfolio. So we need a way of sort of codifying and testing how we measure the asset changes, so soil, water, forest health, and allow for sort of the diversity that each particular property might have with different fauna, but to report in kind of a consistent way. So we've been trialling that with some major financial institutions, large and small scale agribusiness in Australia, and trying to have that in a practical way. And that will mean that land managers can get things like green loans or sustainability linked loans. So green loans are where you're wanting a loan to invest in infrastructure, sort of capex loan, I guess, to undertake a change on your property, or sustainability linked loan is where you're improving your condition over time, and so you're maybe getting, say, 0.5% off your mortgage and So it's a different kind of financial tool that you might get a reward for making those sustainable changes. And that, I guess, sits alongside things like the carbon farming or the nature repair acts that we have in Australia, which are other tools for rewarding and incentivising those practice changes in Australia. So that's one of the things we've been focusing on, Russ.
I want to hear a bit more about, and I'm sure everyone wants to hear a little bit more about the innovation in nature repair markets in Australia, which has just really happened in the last few months, but just a little bit more on financial institutions, because we invite them into our group because we figure there's trillions of dollars. Everyone says money's hard. Well, there is a lot of money actually that's looking for a good home, but it's looking for a very reliable home and one that it can roll up, as you just said, between paddock and portfolio. Part of the problem we're finding with the FIs, and we've got a couple in the group already, is they say, come to us with big numbers. Do not come to us with little numbers. They want to spend hundreds of millions, so it has to work. So just take that a little bit further. What you were sort of saying is that it's not coherent enough yet for them to join it up and quickly invest large amounts in it. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, so I think that's a lot of the work that we've been doing with others on this standard, and in Australia and I think many other countries, there's a lot of work being done on things like a taxonomy. Taxonomy is like the first step, that's just having common language. A standard, I guess, takes it a step further where there's a common understanding of what might be a green activity or a sustainability linked activity that could lead to that kind of finance flow at scale. So we've been piloting it on around 20 different properties this year with some major financial institutions, and we're going to keep scaling that up. But you need that sort of practical testing so that the money can sort of flow at scale.
And just we will come to questions, so be thinking of a question if you want to ask someone. And just to help people know what's happened in Australia, because the nature repair market is I think happening now, and you know, how exciting is that? Is that really going to be transformative, or is it a smaller step? How would you describe it?
So I guess just for context, we've had a carbon farming initiative for over a decade now, so it's probably one of the most mature government-regulated carbon methodology frameworks in the world. There's over 37 methodologies, about 10 to 12 active land sector methodologies that are implemented there. Now, we've still got a long way to go, even after a decade. There's around 2,000 projects nationally. There's 140,000 properties that are over 25 hectares in Australia that are in the sort of agricultural sector. So we've got a long way from 2,000 to 140,000 there, but it is sort of an established scheme that reliably is delivering over 20 million tonnes kind of annually now, and it's still growing. What we got last year was a nature repair market as well to be coupled with that. Now, it is in its very nascent stage, so they're just developing the first methodologies, and we expect to have, similarly, it'll be regulated by the government. We expect to have the first methodologies in 2025, and they are being designed that they can be sort of twinned with the land sector carbon farming methods. So just, I guess, to give a practical example there, that we've worked a lot with WWF Australia and land managers on something called koala-friendly carbon. Under the carbon scheme, we can do environmental plantings that would need, say, at least 4 different species and minimum stem counts. But to do koala-friendly carbon, which would be carbon and nature repair, we have a much greater species density and well over 25 species, sometimes 100 species if it's rainforest plantings. And so there is sort of that baseline of you're doing an activity to store carbon, and then there's some clear additionality and cost differentials. It's like at least $2,000 more expensive a hectare to do koala-friendly plantings than normal plantings.
So from about 2,500 to 5,000 or more?
From about 6 to 8.
Right.
From 6,000 to 8,000.
That's it, yeah. But there's a market for that, obviously.
So there's an emerging market, and it's still very nascent. But we're seeing whether it will end up being tradable credits or it'll flow through things like the disclosures that I was talking about earlier. There's a lot of people thinking within their supply chain how they can financially reward that through things like lower loans or insurance premiums.
Yeah, a colleague in Canada was telling me about one of the Vera schemes that is also weighted in that way, that they're getting a premium for. Thanks so much for that. Keep thinking of your questions. We're going to the end of our panel. Jung Wu, Now,
That's right.
I've got him particularly on the panel because I thought, how can people my age sit up here and have a conversation about innovation and the change that's got to happen over the next 50 years? So I want to hear a little bit about what you're doing, your FAO as an intern, and what your area of specific innovation is. But then I'm going to press you to sort of tell people like me what you need to see happen before you're standing here in 30 years.
Okay. My name is Jung-woo Na from South Korea, and I'm majoring in forestry and climate environmental big data at Koongwon University. And I'm representing the International Forestry Students Association. You may have heard it or you may have not, but it's of forestry students all around the world, 64, 140 universities and over 10,000 students. And we is a world united by forest. I'm sorry. Thank you. And we're doing that by educating and empowering youth, and we send delegations to like international events like this, like CCD COP, CBD COP, UNCCC COP, and we try to raise our youth voices in every event. And you asked about FAO, so I was selected as an FAO intern this, I think, September, and I'll be going to the Global Fire Management Hub, and that's pretty much. And you asked about
you're doing something with satellites as well.
Yeah, but I'm planning not to talk about that.
Okay.
So
maybe a bit hush, but what about? Well, this thing. I mean, is there anything that's come out from the last three speakers that you thought that's the future?
So I thought about an answer about your question.
Okay.
So it might be a general question, not that much related to forest, but if you ask me, what do you think expect the world when I'm your age, is like, I want like climate change to be more mainstream in the world. And actually in the world right now is like, when you talk about climate change, it's more related to like political reasons and economic reasons, and even like in the US, like presidential election is getting affected a lot by that, and there's like rise and decline in climate change discussions, and I hope that will be less and want it to be more mainstreamed. And I want a world where climate change is obvious, that everyone can discuss about and everyone is joining. And I also want, I think that the old generation, in the old generation, the climate change and economy was coupled. So it was coupling, and as more like greenhouse gas was emission, economic growth. But in our generation, I think it's decoupled. So when the more greenhouse gas, the greenhouse gas emissions doesn't match the economic growth. So I want that to be more like. I want that could be like an economic obstacle, but I want the youth generation to solve that problem, and I hope I can be a part of that in that future. Thank you.
You're making a great start. Is there any questions? Otherwise, I'll keep going. Anyone? We can go anywhere on the panel. Jane Maloney has a question. There's a mic out the front there. Just say your name and where you're from.
You said my name, that's cool. I want to ask Guy a question. 37 different methodologies. Oh my word. And you said 10 to 12 in the active land sector. Is there an attempt to reduce them? If there is, how on earth are you going to do it? And also how to measure the impacts on biodiversity in a meaningful way, because quite honestly, the thought of trading and biodiversity gives me cold shivers.
I love that question. My work for the last 5 years has been focused on reducing and harmonizing and integrating the carbon methods, so it's a great one. Look, the history as to why we have 37 methods is really linked to Kyoto. So we had Kyoto accounting lines, and the world was broken down into different carbon pools and different accounting lines. And so all these methods got created to deal with an individual carbon pool, an individual activity. And then we had Paris and we put it into a landscape account, but the methods haven't quite caught up. So we've been working with a big cross-section of stakeholders from ag, conservation, research, science, government, to harmonise that over the past year. And we hope next year that we'll finally get a method after sort of 5 years of work. If so, I believe it's integrated a farmland management method that government. There are some holistic methods under Vera and other standards, but to bring together for the first time, I guess, soil and trees. It's even soil and trees, you can only do them in an individual method, and trees are split into sort of plantation, environmental plantings, natural regeneration, which is like human-induced, and I guess where there's still seed stock. And so putting that all together for the first time is going to be a big step. It's really important to change in, I mentioned 2000 is.
No, yeah, a bit closer, and hold them closer. I think it's the wind blowing your voice.
I mentioned that there's 2,000 properties at the moment. As we get into the next kind of round, the properties get smaller. And if you can't bring together all the different activities and the different carbon pools, it becomes unviable to undertake all the measurement and auditing costs that's required to participate in the scheme. And many look like jigsaw farms, and they have like agroforestry beside production, so you really need the package together. So hopefully we'll bring that to fruition next year. In terms of the biodiversity, it's starting focused on habitat condition. It's not in Australia allowed to be traded as an offset, this nature repair scheme, as it's not part of the compliance program or offsetting to do with development. So it really is a measure of condition health, and I guess the finance flows are more to encourage and enable that extra work that is beyond just carbon thinking, I guess, because it is more expensive and it does require kind of an additional layer of planning. So I think it is quite important to twin it together. But if you try to measure by, and again this goes back to the standard, if you try to measure every individual fauna or attribute, then like we've actually tried that before in the state level in Australia, and we have like koala credits and other things, and it didn't really work because they're not fungible. But habitat condition as a sort of improvement over time.
Did you want to comment on that, Sarah? You've had a lot to do with methodologies being developed in the Australian carbon market. How do you see it operating? Is it working successfully as far as the forest sector in Australia goes?
I think in the forestry sector, we're looking at our current method, and we're looking at every single little lever we can do to tweak. And the government's been really actually very supportive of, if we can come to the government with statistics and more data, they're open to having a look at making tweaks to methods. So it's actually been a really collaborative relationship, and I'd say that that's probably key to this succeeding into the future, is making sure that the government is working with the sectors to make sure that the methods are being created, are going to be used, and they actually achieve the outcome the government's looking to achieve by doing that collaborative approach.
And Sarita, I want to ask you about what's happening in Brazil, but I think it's worth just pausing to say quite clearly, I'm allowing us to mix in climate and nature outcomes. I really don't think we can separate them anymore. For the last year or two, it's become a single conversation. And at Cali, everyone was talking about the same thing in the biodiversity COP. And so here we have to just find a way through. And as Sky, I think, was alluding to there's some learnings out of the way that the carbon system has been created. But as Jane said quite rightly, there's some different challenges. But the challenges we have to solve, aren't they? Otherwise we can't scale. And the scale is what we're going to need for this to work. And I know I'm living in the UK at the moment, and there's a biodiversity net gain legislation. Harry knows all about it if anyone wants to dig into it, which is all about if you build a building here, you have to buy some biodiversity over there. So there are ways of trying to make this sort of thing work, notwithstanding, as you all would immediately think, that's not exactly the same biodiversity, but we have to find a way to make it work. So Rita, in your expose about the way Suzano works and those very large corridors that you're linking up, has the company been able to access carbon or biodiversity payments for any of that, or is it being done in another way?
Yeah. Australia is an amazing example for us because actually in Brazil, we are trying to have a positive politics there for help and to put a price in carbon and biodiversity. The ecosystem services law is under discussion for more than a decade. The carbon market law is under more than a decade under discussion. We are really hope that the carbon market law be released this week. It's in the line to be approved.
Wow.
And we are expecting a lot, so we don't have in Brazil public incentives to do that. What we have is the worldwide incentives like RNDD we were talking about had. We have the voluntary carbon market that it's helping. Brazil has great opportunities around the restoration. We have more than 20 million hectares degraded where we can restore and can generate
20 million hectares in Brazil.
Yeah, to restore. And what Suzano is doing, it's a partnership. This is our innovation. Looking for biodiversity, we have we have our accomplished. We have to do that. We understand that it's our job to restore where we are. But as we want to go beyond in biodiversity, we are doing partnerships. Like we did a partnership with UCN to help us on that. We are a partnership with other institutes to put our money and help us work on the land with neighborhoods. Another really innovative thing that we did looking for money, we create a new company named Biomas with other 5 companies in Brazil, big companies and banks. And this company has one easy deal, restore and protect 4 million hectares in Brazil.
4 million?
Yeah, 4 million. This will be with probably carbon credits, but we are looking other forms that we can access money with investors, with private sector, with government sector to do that. So for us, we don't have a really ways and clear little ways, but Suzano understands that we have to move this with advocacy, with investments, incentives, and places like that to find the new ways to do this in our country.
Yeah, and it's about finding those market instruments that work across scale. I mean, that 20 million hectares of degraded land and a 4 million hectare project, they're mind-boggling size operations and opportunities, aren't they? And I was talking to a financier in London recently who said he had £800 million to invest in climate and nature positive land sector outcomes. And at the moment, we just haven't got the joined up system, as Sky was saying, that allows us to take these size propositions forward. But we are determined to try to work towards solving that. Our group of companies is just about to do a survey across the 35 countries and the 16 million hectares and the big companies of the world. Suzano is in the group, as is Oji at the back here. And we have UPM and Stora Enso and New Forests and Mitsui and Marubeni and a whole host of companies. And we're going to survey what they're actually measuring now, which is going to be a great start because they're all measuring different things. Everyone's matrix of nature measurement is a little bit different. And so we thought it'd be a good start to at least find out what it is that everyone's measuring. And then to Jane's question, is it possible to produce something that is coherent internationally, even if you're measuring koalas in one place and and caribou somewhere else. Sorry, I was looking at you, Eric, and the different the tortoises, the gopher tortoises that I saw in Florida, and so on, and Susano, and measuring whatever would be in your estate. Any other questions for the panel? We have one. I'm not going to keep saying everyone's name because then you don't introduce yourself. Harry, introduce yourself, please.
Hello, my name is Harry. Harry Mills. I'm a researcher at the University of Cambridge and co-chair of the bio-based materials working group of the Global Alliance for Building and Construction. I've got two questions, Ross, if you don't mind. One for Sarita and Susano, and maybe Sky. I was wondering if you maybe could talk a little bit about the recent announcement for Susano's new centre at Cambridge of I think around £10 million at Jesus College, which found out last night, which is quite exciting. Yeah. And then more broadly, I was just wondering if you could maybe talk to the idea of when and how we can get to secondary carbon value to secondary bio-based products, in particular for timber. And in my circles, I've seen this falling over drastically and moving to a point now where we're really looking at these green bonds or green packaging up of multiple buildings or at a city scale. And I'm just be keen on your thoughts.
Thanks, Harry.
Thanks, Harry, to mention that. Susano is a 100 years company, and we did this anniversary this year. And Susano released the new era for the next 100 years. And we want to create a league, what we can do for the next 100 years. Based on that, we started an initiative putting a lot of money in education. And everybody asked for us, okay, and Brazilian education, we are doing this for the last 100 years. And what we want to do is expand. We need the universities looking for bio-based products, how to do forestry management, and bring like the sustainability schools or educations for high school to looking for the forestry, to looking for how we will manage that in the future. And we did yesterday, the sign was yesterday. Marcela is our director. She passed here because she came today from the London to do the sign, and where we will invest $10 million, I think so, to help the school in the forestry education. And we are looking for other universities, looking for other opportunities where we can put this money, not looking only for the eucalyptus, as we are an eucalyptus company, but biodiversity and how we can manage that. A lot of innovations.
That's fantastic. And Sarah or Sky on I think you're talking about carbon being monitored and rewarded in the built environment. Is that where you were going? Yeah.
Yeah, I think
keep it close, Sky, because
we have been seeing a step change through disclosures. Like, it's been really hard to build this into commodity supply chains in general, but in Australia, climate disclosures have now been legislated progressively from next year, and we are sort of starting to see that bite. So I guess I'm hopeful that that's a way to finally kind of build this into the thinking in those chains. And we're also seeing companies assume that nature is coming and going to be legislated, and then they don't want to be kind of caught behind, because I think on the climate risk disclosures, at least in the Australian context, they sort of have felt like that they don't really know how they're going to actually deliver and report on this, and we're still sort of scrambling to get the right collective reporting guidelines so it can actually be operationalised in Australia. So I'm hopeful that that's the way forward, but it has to date been a challenge to build in, I guess, that extra price point into supply chains that's been happening sort of alongside in parallel.
Sarah or Jungwoo, any comment on either? Yeah, Jungwoo.
Actually, when she talked about the carbon market, it was quite interesting to me, because in South Korea, 70% of the land is forest, and out of that 70%, the 70% of forest is owned by private sector. So the Korean government is extremely interested in associating with that the how do you call it, not the voluntary market.
Yeah.
I'm sorry,
Yeah.
the voluntary market, and they want the forest owners to be kind of get into the carbon credit market to make them additional profit and associate that with the bio productivity and stuff, and that's quite interesting to me to hear. Yeah. That's how Korea's work. Very interesting. And actually, at the Korea Pavilion, there was a side event right now, and I attended that. And it was very interesting, and there were like Vera people and GCF people talking about the reality of the volunteer market of the carbon credit and the Article 6.4 and stuff. Thank you.
And I think Korea is absolutely fascinating when it comes to carbon, because at the last FAO Committee on Forestry, the South Korean delegate was doing her statement to the mission, and she said, we now have to start to harvest our trees. Why? Because they've grown up, they've stopped sequestering carbon, and it's time to restart that cycle, which I think everyone here doesn't think is a remarkable thought, but I assure you, in many of the conversations I have with journalists, they would be shocked at that. They would think that somehow you're doing a poor thing for the climate. As Sarah said, though, the farm you mentioned, he's had to restart his harvest and replant operations to create that positive cycle. Although, as you said, Harry, we'll obviously see a lot more uplift and opportunity there when we can properly also report and reward harvested wood products and other things in the value chain. And of course, thinking of our friends from OGI, there are all these other values that we're not even talking about when it comes to creating big opportunities for forestry. This is the Forest Pavilion today, which are to do with nutrients, to do with soil, to do with water. We went to Tokyo not too long ago, and when we heard that the water going through the Oji forests in the northern part of Japan are actually supporting the shellfish. I'd never heard of this before, but the nutrients that they carry in have created this wonderful ecosystem. I'd never thought of that as another ecosystem service. We're getting close to time. Is anyone on the panel? You look like you want to say something, Jung-woo?
That was very interesting. The Korean government and the eco activists are fighting between whether to cut the trees or not, because in the academic area, it's quite I think to it is kind of the mainstream that we should cut the trees, and that's the way for sustainable forest management. And if you look at the forest, only the parts where the trees were cut down has the most biodiversity. So that's where, that's what I wanted to say. Thank you.
That was well said, and you're getting a nod from an expert right next to you. So that's good. We are kind of at time. Anyone had anything they absolutely had to say? Otherwise, we will pull it up. And Sky, come on. Do you want to? No. All right. Well, look. Please thank the panel with me, particularly, might I say, our International Forestry Student Association representative, who didn't even know he was on this panel until about an hour ago. He had a colleague who couldn't make it. So I think you've been very brave and done a really good job of that. But please thank all the panelists and grab any of them for a chat as we leave. Thanks so much.